Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then subscribe now, because this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University. This week I'm joined by Dr. Carolyn Plato, Senior Lecturer in Sports Psychology at Loughborough University, and George Mycock, CEO and founder of MyoMinds. Today's podcast focuses on disordered eating. We'll hear about what disordered eating is and how it's affected George during his time as a young athlete. Caroline and George then discuss the symptoms of disordered eating and how this can affect athletic performance. Finally, we hear what coaches and teammates can do to identify and support athletes that might be experiencing disordered eating. Hi Carolyn, hi George, thanks for coming in today. Today we're going to talk about disordered eating, but before we do, can we just have a little bit of a brief introduction from yourself, starting with Carolyn?
Yeah, sure. My name's Dr. Carolyn Plato. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Loughborough University. My research interests centre around eating and exercise behaviours, specifically looking at disordered eating and exercise amongst athlete populations.
Brilliant. And yourself, George?
So my name is George Mycock. I'm the founder of MyoMinds, the mental health organisation specialising in sport and physical activity. I'm also a student here at Loughborough University, studying an MSc in sport and exercise nutrition.
Very nice. So to kick us off and get us started, Carolyn, can you just explain to us what disordered eating is?
Yeah, so most people will probably have heard of eating disorders. So things like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. So they're clinical eating disorders, and they're characterised by disturbed attitudes towards food and eating. And it can have a significant impact on individuals' quality of life and also their general physical health and mental well-being. Disordered eating is a category of kind of subclinical eating problems that fall just below those clinical eating disorders. And again, it's characterised by a disturbed relationship with food, but it's not quite at the same significant severe level as for clinical eating disorders.
Okay, and we're here with George as well. And George, you've had some experience of this.
Yes.
So could you just talk us through the experience you had and how it affected you?
Okay. So my kind of whole eating disorder story started when I was very young. I used to play rugby, and I was a huge rugby fan. My dad was a huge rugby fan. My family all love rugby. Rugby was kind of my life. And then when I was 13 years old, I broke my spine playing rugby. And that meant that I could no longer play rugby. So for a year, I was waiting for an operation and recovering, and it meant that I gained a lot of weight. And this was very obvious to people around me, leading to me getting kind of like teased, and it was just very apparent. And I became very apparent of it myself. So I started trying to lose weight. I started exercising more. I started dieting. I started losing weight quite rapidly, and I would get encouraged. If you're overweight, obese, and you start losing weight, people seem to see that as a positive. So, it's okay, it's great, keep doing that, keep losing weight. So I started eating less and less and less, and eventually I fell under the description of anorexia nervosa. That then kind of escalated. It kind of changed into bulimia, where I started purging. And some way or another, it's then moved into binge eating disorder, which is kind of what I fall under now, which is basically where you kind of, or at least the way I do it is I overeat in stressful situations, and then it's just kind of without the purging. It's just force feeding, basically.
Okay, and how's that affected you?
So, yeah, kind of as a male, and as someone who was in sport, it's difficult because I think I'm now more aware of it and more open about it. But especially at the start, it was almost embarrassing. Being a guy, it seems to be more frowned upon, and it's something I'm trying to work on with MyoMinds and raise that awareness that it is okay to have an eating disorder and be male. Also, just being someone who's in the gym and being physically active is also something that people don't tend to associate, so it can be quite difficult, almost like I get questioned on the fact that I have it.
That makes sense. So, what in terms of the disordered eating, Carolyn? We talk about symptoms and what we can look for. What kind of symptoms would there be? And then, George, are they the kind of symptoms that anyone picked up on for yourself? So
eating disorders and disordered eating can manifest in lots of different ways. And as George described, those characteristics and those behaviours can change over time. So it's not always necessarily the same symptoms over a period of time. People can oscillate from periods of dieting and restriction to episodes of kind of purging behaviours or overeating. With restrictive eating disorders, things like anorexia nervosa, it's usually characterised by cutting out major food groups or significantly reducing energy intake. So really small portions of food, perhaps avoiding certain food groups altogether. And that's also associated with weight loss, and that will happen sometimes gradually or sometimes quite quickly over a short period of time. With other forms of eating disorder, things like bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, they're characterised more by these episodes of binging that George was talking about. So eating large amounts of food, often quite unhealthy foods, within a short period of time, but that overeating episode is very much linked with a loss of control. So the individual feels like they're unable to control how much they're eating and what they're consuming within that period of time. In bulimia nervosa, that's linked with then episodes of purging. So following an overeating episode, individuals might feel very guilty and worried about how much they've consumed and the potential impact of that on their body shape and their weight. So they may engage in some form of purging behaviour, which could be vomiting, it could be laxative use, it could be diuretic use, or even just excessive exercise behaviour. So, as I said, people oscillate between perhaps periods of restriction, periods of binge eating behaviour, and don't necessarily kind of fit a typical mould all the time. We often see people transition from anorexia nervosa into other forms of eating disorder over a period of time as well.
And what and symptoms-wise, how could people pick up on that? And who are those people who might pick up on these things? And then, George, did that happen for you? Is the kind of follow-up from that?
Yeah, so in sport, so when we're talking about athletes, they don't necessarily always present with kind of some of the typical eating disorder symptoms, but they can be a useful starting point or things for people to look out for. So we normally kind of classify symptoms in kind of three categories. So you've got behavioural, physical and psychological. Behavioural symptoms might refer to changes in eating practices or changes in eating behaviour. So if you notice someone suddenly adopted a very strict diet, or they have cut out major food groups, then that can be perhaps indicative of a tendency towards disordered eating practices, if that's particularly a marked change for that individual, or they might suddenly start having smaller portions, or they might avoid social eating situations altogether, so perhaps no longer eating with the team, or avoiding eating in front of other people. In terms of physical symptoms, from kind of athlete perspective, we're looking for things like fatigue. That can be a really good sign that the individual's not getting enough food in, or that they're not eating appropriately to match their exercise behaviours. But equally, things like exercising more, exercising in a kind of rigid or compulsive way, and also a greater incidence of injuries and of illnesses. So greater susceptibility towards kind of some of these upper respiratory tract infections and things, which again would suggest that the immune system and things might be compromised. So, coaches and others can be on the lookout for some of these signs and symptoms. And I think the biggest thing is there a change in that individual? Have they previously been happy, well, injury-free, training well, performance is good? Has there been a shift? Are they now socially withdrawn, perhaps demonstrating low mood? Have they made some changes to their eating practices? And it's sort of the combination of some of those things that might point towards a potential eating issue.
Yeah, I kind of relate to a lot of that myself, and also with the Mind stories that we share, there's a lot of stuff like that kind of showing up. Like for me personally, the whole behavioural changes was definitely a big thing for me. As soon as I could start moving again, I could start losing the weight. It was not wanting to eat around people, not wanting people to see my physique or see my body. It just became kind of obsessive. And I think it's very common that from the stories that I've seen through my minds is that people tend to have this kind of fear around the idea of being observed, and also I think as well, it's something to just highlight quickly is I think for coaches listening to this as well, it's important to note that when athletes do start developing disordered eating patterns, sometimes you can see positive things in their performance. So if an athlete does start eating less food, their body weight will start going down, and maybe their power will still be the same, so their power to weight ratio has gone up, so their performance may briefly improve, which for a coach it might seem, this is great, why would I try and stop that? But it doesn't change the the psychological underpinning that's causing that issue.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's this assumption that if an athlete is performing well, they are in good health, or good physical health, and that good performance equals good health. And it can be challenging as a coach or sports professional to want to kind of challenge the status quo if everything seems to be working well in relation to performance. But if you have noticed significant weight loss or change in an athlete's demeanour, then it's still worth kind of exploring that and having some of those conversations to try and unpack whether or not there may be something else going on.
And with yourself, you mentioned at the start about people positively praising the weight loss being the big thing. Mm-hmm. So how could people not do that? Because I mean, it is perceived that weight loss, if you're overweight, is a good thing. How would you feel if you could have been better supported, I suppose, during that phase? I mean, what kind of rapid weight loss are we talking about?
I went from I was around 130 kilos at 14 years old without ever touching a weight, so none of it was muscle, and I went down to, in probably the space of a year, down to, I'm not sure what it is in kilos, I think probably about 65-70 kilos, something like that. So I lost a lot of weight. I think the issue is just kind of talking around physique and around that kind of thing. I think it would be much easier if we try and limit, especially within like a team and within sporting setting. Why not talk about how someone is feeling around the way they're eating, or someone is feeling around the way they're performing due to their nutritional attitudes? Why be like, I can see you're physically changing, so that's the thing. Why not be like, you're how are you feeling about the way you're eating? How are you feeling like full? Are you feeling well? How are you enjoying your food at the moment? Rather than just strictly looking at physique and obviously performance you need to talk about a bit as a coach, but there's ways you can tailor around it.
I think there's an issue there as well. Sometimes it's not necessarily visible, so an individual may not present with significant or rapid weight loss, and relying on some of those overt physical signs may not be a good indicator as to whether someone is struggling with their eating behaviour. In fact, you might not notice a significant weight loss until quite far down the line, when an individual might already be kind of in the throes of an eating problem. So psychological well-being and understanding some of the behaviours that go alongside these eating problems may be a better marker for coaches and other sports professionals to be using when they're trying to evaluate the kind of eating related health of an athlete that they're working with.
Yeah, I have experience with that. I think because example is like rugby players and things like that. Like they would look like physical specimens, like they're muscular and things, so that you'd think. And I personally have had a doctor tell me that I told him, he said that he looked at my kind of screen and said, you have anorexia, and I was like, yes, and he said, you don't look like you have anorexia. Obviously it wasn't a fantastic thing for me.
And I think it's that about those stereotypes, isn't it? I think people have particular views on what people with eating disorders look like, and we talked a little bit already around it might be considered atypical for males to have an eating disorder. So I think there's an education and awareness piece in this around challenging people's perceptions and views as to what someone with an eating disorder looks like. I often get asked when I describe the area that I work in research, that I talk around, eating disorders in athletes, and people go, oh, is that a thing? Athletes are very healthy, and they're very focused on their nutrition, and they're performing at a really high level. Why didn't realise that perhaps they were equally or more vulnerable to eating problems than non-athletes? So I think there's some challenges there around people's views and stereotypes around who can suffer from an eating disorder, and also what they look like, because we know eating disorders come in all different shapes and sizes, and they can affect the entire population.
Yeah, certainly. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about your research? So specifically, what do you research, and what the outcomes of that research been?
Yeah, absolutely. So, some of the work that we've looked at recently, alongside my PhD students, Charlotte Scott and Sebastian Sangren, has been to try and understand a little bit more about why athletes are vulnerable to eating problems, and also explore perhaps ways in which we might be able to intervene more effectively with this population. So there's lots of research out there that's tried to understand why we see particularly high levels of disordered eating and eating disorders amongst athlete groups.
What do you mean by high levels? What are we talking there?
So in the general population, we see rates of eating disorders around 1% of the population, so 1 to 2%, depending, slightly higher for conditions like binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa compared to anorexia. In athlete populations, it's much higher than that. So some of the best controlled studies have indicated that perhaps 1 in 5 female athletes might meet the criteria for a clinical eating disorder. So that's 20%. And 1 in 12 male athletes, so around 16% there. So it's quite a significant jump, I suppose, in comparison to the general population. And researchers, not just myself, but others across the world, are trying to understand why we see this particularly high level amongst the athlete population. And the general thinking is that actually athletes face additional pressures within the sports environment that may make them more vulnerable to the development of eating problems. And that can include pressures from the sporting environment or from people involved in that environment. So, for example, in the sporting environment, we know that there's challenges around the visibility of the body. So in some sports, or in quite a few sports, there's a pressure to wear certain clothing, which is quite revealing, but also facilitates body comparison. So wearing tight clothing is very common in sports like athletics or aesthetic sports like gymnastics. And that can really place a high degree of emphasis on the body size, shape and appearance, and facilitate comparison between athletes. One of the areas that we've been looking at is the role of teammates. So to try and understand a little bit more about the social context in which athletes find themselves, and how teammates might be involved in perhaps the contagion of disordered eating practices, but also how they might play a protective role in preventing eating problems amongst this vulnerable group. So we've done a few studies in this area. I say we. My PhD student Charlotte Scott has led on this, and she demonstrated through a systematic review that teammates can both positively and negatively impact on disordered eating practices in athletes. So in a positive sense, having supportive friendships, promoting healthy eating practices, and being vigilant against disordered eating within a sporting environment can be related to more positive and healthy eating practices amongst athletes. However, where there's a high level of perceived pressure from teammates, or where there's the perception that your teammates are engaging in disordered eating practices, that's linked to higher levels of disordered eating in this group. So what your teammates do seem to be quite important in understanding at an individual level what athletes may be, or why they may be particularly vulnerable to these problems.
And is there research around other people, so coaches, parents, and their role in those kind of interventions and help or hindrance?
Yeah, so I think coaches have sometimes got a little bit of a bad reputation within this space, and have perhaps been positioned more as part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. there's work around kind of critical comments in sport and how they could perhaps trigger disordered eating. So making comments around someone's body appearance or their size and shape can have negative outcomes for some individuals. When we spoke to coaches in some of our earlier research, they told us that they were really worried about saying the wrong thing, about interacting with athletes with whom they thought might have an eating problem, for fear of making the situation worse. And actually, I think they're often really pivotal individuals, both in terms of identifying when an eating problem exists, but also in supporting an athlete through the recovery process. So in making sure that they seek support, but also in facilitating their involvement back into training once they're ready to do so.
Yeah, I think there'll be coaches kind of listening to this most likely who think that it's not kind of their job to deal with the eating disorder issues and things like that, and almost they may even be worried because of this blame culture that Carolyn was mentioning, that you can be blamed for something, and so why would you want to raise awareness for the fact that this could be something that you could contribute to or could have possibly contributed to, but I would argue that if you raise awareness of eating disorders to your athletes, and also raise awareness of the subconscious things that the teammates can be doing to each other in raising these kind of symptoms of disordered eating and just mental health issues in general, you're going to lead to an overall kind of awareness of each other, and also you're going to reduce the subconscious things that are going to be happening. So rather than, I think an issue that coaches tend to worry is that if you increase the amount of awareness around mental health and around disordered eating, then you're going to increase the amount of your athletes that are going to be diagnosed with these issues, and that might lead to you losing athletes. But I would also argue that, what about the athletes that you're losing because they didn't realise? If they find out sooner, they can get help sooner, and then they can get improvements in those kind of issues. Well,
so if you've got those kind of numbers, 20% or 5% or wherever it may be for males, females, if you are losing X amount of athletes, when we're talking performance-wise, there's a huge number of athletes that are probably not reaching their potential, and it may well be due to all those reasons you just discussed.
Yeah, I think because it's such a common thing in mental health as well, is that everyone thinks, we might miss out on these elite athletes. What if this amazing athlete didn't reach their potential because they had an eating disorder and then they just stopped? But what about all the athletes that we've missed out on? The amount of athletes that have dropped out because they had an eating disorder issue or mental health issue and was just told to ignore it, or just no one spoke about it, so they just ignored it, and it meant that they crashed and they couldn't continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, when we look at some of the figures, it's highly likely that coaches working within sport will come across an athlete with an eating problem at some point in their career, and being armed with information about how to spot the signs, how to support an athlete with an eating problem is going to be really important. So that, we know within broader eating disorders, the earlier that you can intervene, the earlier that you can identify an individual with an eating problem, the more successful outcome we have in relation to recovery and reintegration back into work, life, sport, etc. So coaches are in an ideal position because of the day-to-day interactions that they have with their athletes, in order to be able to identify when athletes might be struggling with these problems. That said, we're not expecting them to treat or manage the problem. It's more as a kind of signposting into services, so that athletes can get the support that they need at an early stage. So recognising the important role that they have in facilitating access and signposting to some of those support services is really important in making sure that what perhaps might be disordered eating doesn't then progress on into kind of a more severe clinical eating disorder that is much more challenging to treat and support.
So how do we go about helping that and improving that? I.e., for example, helping the coach understand eating disorders better, and helping the coach to, whether we're saying diagnose or signpost the athletes. How are we going to help coaches, and what should coaches be doing to be more confident in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not asking them to diagnose. We're not asking them to say, right, I think this is anorexia nervosa. I think it's just about spotting some of those general symptoms that we've talked about already, to be able to feel confident enough to have a conversation with an athlete and say, actually, what is there something going on here?
But how would they become more confident, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, so, and this leads on to kind of some of the stuff that we've developed. And one of the things that from conversations with coaches, they told us that they wanted more information about this. So what are the symptoms? How can they approach an athlete? How can they have what is sometimes quite a difficult conversation around eating behaviour and their attitudes towards food? So we've developed an online Cpd program, which is 5 modules. It takes 2 to 3 hours for coaches and other sports professionals to complete, and they get taken through or get provided with information about what eating disorders are, what are the symptoms, how you can spot them, and how you can support an athlete, approach and support an athlete who might be suffering with these problems, and kind of where you can signpost onto as well. As I said, this is not about coaches trying to treat or provide guidance around these disorders. It's around knowing where to signpost to. So quite a few coaches have been through this online program now, and it seems to be helpful and useful, and that's something that if people are interested in, they can find out a little bit more information about.
And have you got research around that at all, or is this early stages of things, in that those coaches with more knowledge will be able to intervene earlier and therefore affect this, or where are we with that kind of?
We're still early stages in terms of a formal evaluation of the course, but we have some pilot research from a small group of users who've told us, after having done the course, they have increased knowledge and confidence in identifying and supporting athletes with eating problems. We've also demonstrated or identified that they have a reduced stigma towards individuals with eating problems after having completed the course, and also an increased appreciation of the impact of some of these disordered eating practices on both athlete health and performance. So they're quite positive outcomes from our perspective.
And George, do you think these kind of interventions from coaches or parents or teammates would have assisted yourself?
Definitely, yeah. I think just making mental health and disordered eating more of a norm. If coaches know more about it, if parents know more about it, if individuals within the team and within the whole sporting environment know more about it, and it's just spoken about more and understood more, then obviously that's going to help kind of untangle the chaos of what's going on in your head when something like that is happening. If people around you are all kind of just acting normal about it and not shocked, or no doctor is telling you, you don't look like you have an eating disorder, you're instantly going to feel calmer about it, and then you're going to be in a place where you can work on it, and you can get help, and you'll be more inclined to seek help as well, because it's not weird anymore. It's a norm.
Yeah, raising awareness around these issues is really important for reducing some of the stigma that's associated with them as well. Athletes can feel very vulnerable in kind of admitting to someone that they have an issue with their eating, and it's about, as George shares, normalising that conversation and making sure that people feel able to seek support and seek help when they may be struggling with their eating.
Yeah, and that's what I try to do with My Minds, is we share these athletes' stories, and we share sporting professionals' stories. And it's trying to create that kind of brutal honesty, just the real actual honesty around mental health, around disordered eating, around the issues that a lot of athletes, as we've seen from the statistics that Carolyn presented with us, go through. And the website for that is myominds.com.
Myominds.
Myominds, yeah. Okay. MYOMINDS.com.
Perfect.
I think it would just be really useful to signpost to other sources of support as well. So if you're worried about your own or other people's eating behaviour or attitudes, then there's lots of support from BEAT, which is the UK Eating Disorders charity. So you can go and have a look at their website. If you're a coach and you're worried about an athlete with an eating problem, then encourage them to go and seek support from their local GP or family doctor. Or you can have a look and there's local and national eating disorder charities and organisations who have lots of information on their own websites as well. So do signpost people who may be struggling to those sources of support.
And how would, just to kind of almost wrap up, is that how are national governing bodies kind of responding to this? Are national governing bodies taking any of this on board, or should they be more seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think so within broader kind of coach education, there's a greater emphasis now on mental health in sport, and in response to some of the policy changes at wider government level, there is a greater appreciation for the vulnerability of athletes to mental health issues, and eating disorders is definitely part of that conversation. I'm hopeful in years to come that we'll see eating disorders education and become part of that conversation as well, and become something that is just implemented within coaching education more broadly.
So if you had a magic wand, that's what would happen.
Absolutely,
they would bring it in and they would take it on more.
Yeah.
Okay, we're kind of at a stage to wrap up now, and I know that you've got your course and you've got My Own Minds. Is there anything you guys would like to add to signpost other people to anything else around what we've talked about?
I think one thing I do want to mention is like the local charities, like you were saying. I think it's important that you do seek for local charities, especially. Like My Own Minds has recently partnered with First Steps ED, who are a local charity here in Loughborough, in Nottingham, etc. And I think it's important to seek those things, because I think often as well you can usually get faster responses from those kind of groups as well. So yeah.
Yeah, there'll be face-to-face opportunities to interact with other people who might be experiencing similar things as well.
Mm-hmm. And are you guys on Twitter or anything like that for people to kind of message you if they hear anything and want to kind of ask you anything?
You go first.
It's just at Carolyn Plato on Twitter. So, feel free to get in touch.
My Own Minds is on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, it's on my LinkedIn.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's everywhere. You can't not find us.
Brilliant. Well, thank you really, thanks for giving us a brief insight really into the world of disordered eating and some ideas around how people can pick up on that sooner, how interventions can happen, and how if you had a magic wand we could change this through kind of NGBs and getting it a little bit more out there to encourage people to understand it a little bit better. Thanks for coming in. Hopefully people will get into contact with you, have a look at those additional sources and kind of grab some questions with you. But thanks very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Loughborough Sportcast. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now. We'll see you next time.